I remember the day I opened Liana's sweet spot like it was yesterday, though it's been 5 years now. The shop was tiny, barely space for a counter, a couple of tables, and a small display case, but it was mine. I had scraped together savings from every job I could find, baking at odd hours for catering gigs, working weekends in a café I hated, even tutoring kids in math to pay the rent. My ex-friends, Marcy, Elena, and Nina, had all graduated college, moved on to real jobs, and made fun of my humble little venture.
A donut shop? Marcy had laughed once.
Seriously, Liana, this is your big plan? They didn't see the long game.
They never did.
I had learned early that their laughter didn't define me. Their judgment didn't define me. Their tiny victories over my confidence were like grains of sugar. They dissolved under heat, and I knew how to turn heat into something sweet. While they were busy chasing status, following trends, posting pictures of flat whites and overpriced croissants, I was quietly learning the language of real estate, property investment, and city development. I'd started small, observing foot traffic, learning about building codes, checking zoning restrictions, and keeping notes in my tiny notebook. Every lunch break, every weekend, every evening spent cleaning my own floors and folding my own napkins became research. I even befriended the elderly owners of the neighboring shops, asking subtle questions, learning who paid what rent, who owned which property, who was looking to sell. No one suspected I had ambitions beyond the frosting and dough. I smiled politely, nodded, baked donuts, and let the whispers continue.
She'll never make it. She's too small time. And I let them.
Because ambition doesn't shout.
Ambition waits.
When I heard about the block coming up for sale, my pulse quickened. It was a perfect storm, a once-in-a-decade opportunity to own the entire street. And I wasn't just going to buy one property, I was going to take control of every lease, every storefront, every building they thought was untouchable. Marcy's café, Elena's boutique, the tiny office spaces above, my signature could determine their future.
And I would.
Quietly, calmly, unapologetically. The acquisition process wasn't easy. I met with brokers, negotiated terms, signed non-disclosure agreements, and funded the down payments with the savings I'd accumulated. I didn't need anyone to cheer me on. The thrill of quiet control, the thought of finally tipping the scales, was enough. Every moment I spent walking the block in the evenings, noting cracks in the sidewalks, checking delivery entrances, or measuring windows, was a step toward my ultimate victory. I wasn't just buying property, I was buying leverage, validation, and poetic justice. Now, standing behind my counter, I glanced outside. The cafe across the street had opened for the day. I recognized the barista Elena had hired, the pastries neatly arranged as if to flaunt their success. None of them had any clue that the person they had mocked and dismissed was quietly about to pull the strings that would determine their fate.
I smiled faintly.
They never saw me coming, not in their wildest dreams. The phone rang, a shrill reminder that the world outside my little bakery had begun to shift. It was the broker, confirming the final steps for the block sale. My stomach fluttered with anticipation, but my face remained calm, unassuming, the same expression I'd worn for years whenever Marcy, Elena, or Nina had rolled their eyes at my tiny shop.
I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to brag.
Everything was moving quietly, deliberately, just as I had planned. I hung up and glanced out the window. Across the street, Elena's café bustled with morning customers, their chatter blending with the hiss of espresso machines. Marcy leaned against the counter, checking her phone, probably scrolling through social media updates about brunch deals and influencer visits. They had no idea that the upcoming sale would redefine their entire street, their sense of security, their carefully constructed success. The thought sent a quiet thrill through me, a calm, controlled satisfaction that only comes from years of patient planning. I went about my morning routine, arranging fresh donuts in the display case, cleaning tables, and serving customers. To anyone passing by, it looked like a normal day at Liana's sweet spot. But inside, my mind raced with strategy. Every call to the broker, every email confirming escrow details, every signed document, it all meant that soon, the power balance on this block would shift irrevocably. And I would be at the center of it. Around noon, a familiar group of customers entered the bakery, friends of my ex-friends, laughing loudly about the new cafe across the street. Their voices carried, unguarded, full of the smugness of those who believed they were untouchable. One of them, a tall man with perfectly coiffed hair, glanced at me and smirked.
Cute little place you've got here, Liana. Must be tough competing with the big names.
I smiled politely, serving them coffee and pastries, all the while imagining how quickly that big name would now need my approval to continue operations. Later, I walked the block casually, pretending to inspect my storefront while actually reviewing the terms of the leases for Marcy and Elena's cafe spaces. Their reactions were already subtle but telling. Elena caught sight of me from her window and froze mid-pour, her eyes widening slightly. Marcy's smile faltered when she noticed me across the street, carrying a clipboard, looking as if I belonged to the entire street. I let them stew in their uncertainty, watching quietly as anxiety began to ripple through them. Back in the bakery, I had a flashback, one of the earliest days after I opened. Marcy had leaned over the counter, sipping a latte she had bought just to mock me. "Liana, I don't know why you bother," she had said, smirking. "Nobody even comes here. Your donuts are cute, I guess." I had smiled and nodded, pretending humility, but inside I had felt a spark of defiance. That moment, that dismissal, had been another brick in the foundation of my plan. I remembered it vividly now, feeling the same quiet, controlled determination that had fueled every step since. By mid-afternoon, the broker called again. "All documents are in order," he said. "Escrow closes tomorrow. You'll officially own the block." My heart raced, but my expression remained calm. "Perfect," I replied. I hung up and looked out the window at Elena's cafe, imagining the realization dawning when she checked her inbox and saw the official notification. She had no idea her tenure on this block was about to end. I spent the rest of the day preparing subtle communications, emails confirming lease terminations, notifications about zoning regulations, and polite reminders that the new ownership would enforce terms strictly. I wanted them to understand the inevitability of their situation without having to raise my voice. There is a certain satisfaction in control exercised quietly, invisibly, without theatrics. As evening approached, Marcy stopped by my bakery under the guise of picking up donuts for her staff meeting. She smiled too widely, her voice slightly tense. "Liana, your donuts are really good," she said. "I mean, I guess they've gotten popular, huh?" I handed her a box, smiling politely. "Thank you. Business has been steady," I said, keeping my tone light. She didn't notice the subtle edge beneath my calm voice, the edge that meant she was on borrowed ground. The balance of power had begun to tilt, and she could feel it without knowing why. Once she left, I walked through the shop, touching the counter and the display case, imagining how everything I had built, my bakery, my reputation, my patience, had converged into this moment. This was more than property acquisition. This was validation, subtle and unstoppable, the kind that comes when the underestimated finally claims what has always been theirs. Night fell, and the block grew quiet. I stood outside, looking at my little shop bathed in streetlight, then at the cafe across the street. Soon, the cafe's lease would expire. Soon, the owners who once mocked me would have no choice but to answer to me. I allowed myself a small private smile, the kind that comes from knowing your patience and persistence have worked in your favor. And for the first time, I felt the intoxicating calm of inevitability, the quiet satisfaction that comes before the storm of revelation. The countdown had begun. 30 days. That was all they had before the balance shifted completely. And I would be waiting, calm and deliberate, as the moment arrived. The next morning, the block felt different, subtle, almost imperceptible, but I could sense it. Even before stepping out of my bakery, I noticed the tension hanging in the air. Elena had left her cafe's door slightly ajar, a small oversight that signaled distraction. Marcy paced in front of her boutique, phone glued to her ear, talking in sharp, clipped tones that betrayed panic beneath the veneer of casual conversation. Their carefully curated confidence was cracking, and I didn't need to intervene to see it. Just being there, existing in the shadow of my own preparation, was enough to unsettle them. I opened the bakery door, the bell jingling softly, and stepped out, clipboard in hand, pretending to check deliveries. In reality, I was observing, noting every facial twitch, every nervous glance, every subtle indication that they were beginning to grasp the inevitability of what was coming. Marcy looked up, caught my eyes, and her carefully constructed smile faltered. Elena stiffened mid-step, coffee in hand, and nearly dropped the cup. I didn't move closer, I didn't speak. My presence alone, calm and deliberate, carried authority that they had never anticipated from someone they had dismissed as tiny time. I remembered the lunch table from 5 years ago when they had laughed at my menu planning, the way they had whispered behind their hands, mocking my donuts and my limited ambitions. I had sat there silently, listening, smiling politely, but every word had planted a seed. Every insult, every sneer, every casual dismissal had been logged in my mind, catalogued for years. They thought I wasn't paying attention. They thought I was too small to matter. They were wrong. The broker's call came just after noon, confirming that the sale of the block was official and that all leases would transfer under my ownership at the end of the month. I smiled faintly as I listened, my calm demeanor a mask for the exhilaration that surged quietly beneath the surface. I thanked him politely and hung up, then looked across the street at Elena's café. She had just stepped outside to greet a delivery, and for a moment, our eyes met. There was a flicker of recognition there, subtle but undeniable, a hint that she was beginning to realize her empire was built on borrowed ground. Inside the bakery, I prepared a fresh batch of pastries while listening to my phone buzz with emails from the broker and property manager. One was addressed to Marcy and Elena, confirming the transfer of ownership and the expiration of their leases. I hadn't sent it, I didn't need to. The official notification alone was enough to sow unease. And yet, I allowed myself to imagine their reactions when they read it: disbelief, panic, anger, and eventually reluctant acknowledgement. It was a slow burn, and I intended to savor every moment. The afternoon brought more signs. A delivery driver accidentally mentioned the new ownership in passing, unaware of whom he was speaking to. Marcy froze mid-step, her shopping bags dangling from her arms, and Elena's hand twitched involuntarily. I noticed it all, calm and deliberate, cataloging the moments as though they were data points in an experiment I had been conducting for years. A young woman entered my bakery, a regular customer, and commented on the quiet tension outside. "Everything okay?" she asked, glancing toward the café. I smiled softly. "Just business as usual," I said, pouring coffee. But inside, I felt the thrill of anticipation, the kind that comes when you know the moment of revelation is near. Later, Marcy stormed into my bakery under the pretense of placing a bulk order for her boutique staff. She tried to mask her tension with false cheerfulness. "Liana, these donuts are still really good," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I handed her the box she requested and nodded. "Thank you, Marcy. I appreciate your order." There was a brief silence as she realized I was calm, collected, and entirely in control. That silence said more than any argument or confrontation ever could. By evening, I walked the block again, clipboard in hand, pretending to inspect my property. I noticed subtle signs of worry in both Marcy and Elena, the way they checked their phones constantly, the way they whispered to their employees with urgent tones, the slight tremor in their hands. The power balance had begun to shift without a single word from me. I had always believed that control exercised quietly was far more potent than any confrontation, and now I was witnessing it firsthand. I paused in front of Elena's café and watched her pace, clearly debating some desperate course of action. I let her stew, my presence deliberate but distant. There was no need for confrontation yet. The tension was more delicious when allowed to build, when the inevitability of their situation became apparent through observation alone. Inside the bakery, I began to map out the next steps. I would need to coordinate with the property manager for official notifications, ensure legal documentation was airtight, and plan the subtle announcements that would ensure Marcy and Elena had no room for negotiation. Every detail mattered. Every small misstep on their part would reinforce the reality that I had quietly, strategically, and deliberately claimed the power they had never imagined I could wield. As night fell, the block grew quieter, the tension lingering like the aroma of my fresh pastries. I stood at the doorway, looking across the street at the café. Soon, their lease would expire. Soon, my signature at the bottom of the transfer documents would become undeniable proof that they were no longer in control. And I would watch quietly as they realized it, their arrogance and dismissiveness transformed into disbelief, panic, and reluctant acknowledgement. I reflected on my journey, from the small mocked donut shop to this moment of quiet dominance. Every late night of baking, every careful investment, every moment I had listened and observed while they laughed at me had led here. I had endured dismissal, ridicule, and underestimation, but now the power was mine. Their fate rested not on my words, not on my anger, but on the quiet inevitability I had built patiently over years. The realization settled over me with a serene satisfaction. I wasn't seeking revenge in the conventional sense. I wasn't shouting or publicly humiliating them. My triumph was quieter, subtler, and far more powerful. It was the slow, unstoppable realization that the person they had mocked, overlooked, and dismissed had quietly claimed the upper hand, and there was nothing they could do to reverse it. I closed the bakery for the night, turning off the lights and stepping outside into the cool evening air. The city around me continued unaware, moving through its rhythms, while I stood in the calm eye of a storm I had created with patience, strategy, and silent determination.
30 days. That was all it would take.
30 days until the balance tipped completely, until Liana, the small-time baker, became the undeniable authority on the block they had laughed at. And I would be there, calm and collected, watching the inevitability unfold with quiet satisfaction. The first official notice arrived in the morning, delivered to Elena's café and Marcy's boutique. I had done everything through legal channels, polite but unyielding, everything airtight, everything indisputable. The letters were simple: confirmation of lease expiration, new ownership under my name, and the effective date. I watched from the bakery's window as Elena tore the envelope open, her face changing almost immediately from casual confidence to disbelief, her fingers trembling as she read each word. Marcy, standing a few feet away at the boutique entrance, froze mid-step, her mouth opening and closing as if she were trying to speak, but no words came out.
I didn't intervene. I didn't need to.
The beauty of patience is that the moment it manifests needs no reinforcement. I allowed them to absorb the weight of reality on their own. Their faces were priceless, a mixture of shock, panic, and that faint, unavoidable sting of recognition that they had underestimated me for far too long. Inside, I kept busy arranging pastries, serving customers, all with the calm demeanor I had cultivated over years of quiet observation. I let the subtle power of my actions ripple outward without comment. Every glance from the window, every whisper of surprise, every anxious step on the sidewalk outside reminded me that my years of patience and strategy were coming to fruition. By mid-morning I began receiving indirect reports from brokers and property managers, questions from tenants in the other buildings about lease renewals, inquiries from suppliers about new ownership, even calls from Elena's staff, hesitant and unsure, wondering if everything was really happening. I smiled at each update, letting the knowledge settle quietly in my chest. Control, once exercised subtly, is more satisfying than any confrontation. The afternoon brought the first direct confrontation. Elena appeared at the bakery door, a forced smile plastered on her face, though her eyes betrayed panic.
"Liana, can we talk?" she asked, trying to sound casual. I nodded, gesturing to a small table. She sat, hands clasped tightly over her purse. I don't understand," she stammered. "I thought the block wasn't for sale yet. I thought we had more time. This is sudden." I poured 2 cups of coffee, setting one in front of her, and smiled calmly. "The sale has been in motion for months," I said evenly. "Everything has been conducted legally and transparently. The leases are expiring, and the ownership is transferring as scheduled. There's no room for negotiation." I let the words hang for a moment, watching as her expression shifted from confusion to dawning panic. "Your lease, like all the others, has a fixed expiration date. After that, you'll be subject to the new ownership terms, which, as you know, are under my name." Her face paled. You're serious?" I nodded, calm and deliberate. "Completely. I've been patient, yes, but the process has always been inevitable. Your lease is ending, and everything here will now answer to me." The tremor in her hands betrayed the fear she had tried to suppress, and I felt a quiet satisfaction, not in cruelty, but in the inevitability of justice being recognized. Marcy arrived a few minutes later, barging in under the guise of support for Elena, though her posture screamed frustration and disbelief. "Liana, this isn't fair," she said, voice tight. "We've invested years into this street, into our businesses. You can't just take it over." I smiled faintly, calm as ever. "I didn't take it over," I said. "I simply participated in a legal process. The opportunity presented itself, and I acted. You, of course, had the chance to invest or plan ahead, but you chose to mock and dismiss me instead." Their protests fell flat. The truth was indisputable. I had acted quietly, patiently, deliberately. I had played the long game while they reveled in their short-term confidence, their arrogance, their dismissal of someone they believed to be insignificant. And now, the scales had shifted. Over the next few days, subtle chaos rippled through the block. Suppliers called,
asking if they should reroute deliveries to the new ownership. Staff whispered nervously to each other, wondering what this meant for their jobs. Elena's Café and Marcy's boutique attempted to negotiate extensions, but the answer was always the same. The block was sold, the ownership was mine, and the leases would expire as legally outlined. Even their customers began to notice the tension. Word spread quickly. The small bakery across the street, once mocked and dismissed, now controlled the block. Their reaction ranged from curiosity to fascination, and soon foot traffic in my shop surged, not because of any marketing campaign, but because the story itself was compelling. People were drawn to the space where the underdog had quietly claimed authority, the quiet triumph of patience and strategy. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the brick buildings, I walked the block again. Marcy and Elena were outside, pacing, speaking in hushed tones, clearly planning desperate moves to mitigate the situation. I paused, letting them stew in their unease, imagining the panic growing in their minds. 30 days. 29. 28. Each passing day brought me closer to the ultimate realization of years of quiet effort, years of unseen labor, years of deliberate patience. I reflected on my own journey, how every insult, every sneer, every dismissive remark had fueled my resolve. They had mocked my tiny bakery, my humble beginnings, my slow, steady work ethic. But that mockery had become the foundation of my strategy. I had been underestimated, yes, but that underestimation was my advantage. It allowed me to move quietly, invisibly, until the moment of reckoning arrived. That night, I returned to the bakery after closing, the lights dimmed and the streets quiet. I prepared a fresh batch of pastries, each movement calm and deliberate. The aroma of sugar and yeast filled the small space, a reminder that I had built something tangible, something real, something no one could take away. My triumph was not in spectacle, not in confrontation, but in the inevitability of recognition, the quiet acknowledgement that I had acted when others had doubted, mocked, and dismissed me. And I knew deep in my chest that when the 30 days ended, when the final signatures were official, Marcy and Elena would finally understand the full weight of what they had ignored for so long. Their arrogance, their mockery, their laughter, it would all have paved the way for my victory, a victory built not on vengeance, but on patience, intelligence, and quiet authority. The morning of the final lease notices arrived like a drumbeat, steady and unavoidable. I opened the bakery, the smell of freshly baked pastries filling the air, and looked across the street at Elena's Café and Marcy's boutique. They were both there early, pacing, phones in hand, eyes darting, mouths moving without sound, as if arguing with the universe itself. I poured coffee for a regular, smiling politely, masking the thrill that surged beneath the calm surface. This was it, the moment when years of quiet strategy would intersect with the inevitability of consequence. I stepped outside, clipboard in hand, pretending to inspect deliveries. The ex-friends froze mid-step when they saw me. Elena's lips parted in shock, Marcy's eyes widened, and for a fleeting moment, they both looked like children caught in a game they didn't understand. I walked slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of my presence underscore the reality they had refused to acknowledge for so long. Their arrogance, their mockery, their laughter, it had all led to this precise moment of reckoning. Inside, the bakery hummed with activity, but my attention remained on the block across the street. The property manager had confirmed that the final documents were processed. By the end of the day, ownership would officially transfer. I imagined the realization dawning on Elena and Marcy, their leases expiring, their businesses now subject to the authority of someone they had dismissed as inconsequential. I didn't need to confront them. I didn't need to threaten them. The law, the contracts, the signed documents, they were my voice, my instrument, my silent assertion of power. As noon approached, Elena's staff arrived at the bakery, whispering nervously, asking questions I answered with calm clarity. Yes, I said, pouring coffee, the leases are expiring. Yes, the ownership has transferred. Yes, everything now falls under my authority. Their relief was immediate. They had no desire to oppose me, no desire to argue. They had recognized the quiet power in patience and preparation, and now, under my control, the block's operations would continue smoothly, efficiently, and unquestionably. Elena herself arrived shortly after, stepping through the bakery door with a forced smile that barely masked her panic. "Liana, this can't be happening," she said, voice trembling. "We've built something here. How can you just—" I held up a hand politely, calm and composed. "Elena, the opportunity presented itself, and I acted within legal and ethical bounds. The leases have expired, the ownership is now official, and the control of this block is mine. Everything you've built remains, but under the authority of the new owner. That's me. Her face paled, a mixture of disbelief and grudging acknowledgement washing over her features. You really planned this all along," she whispered, almost to herself. I nodded, keeping my tone soft, calm, and deliberate. I observed. I learned. I acted patiently. And now, the result is inevitable. Mockery has consequences, and dismissal has limits. You may have laughed at my small bakery, Elena, but it was never small in ambition, preparation, or patience. Marcy entered next, phone still in hand, frantically checking updates. She looked at me, eyes wide, and for the first time, the arrogance that had defined her entire adult life was absent. You own the block?" she asked, voice barely audible. I nodded again, smiling faintly, letting the silence speak for itself. The realization sank in slowly, painfully. Every step, every mock, every dismissive glance had led to this, the undeniable quiet assertion of authority. I could see the panic rising as they processed the reality. Their staff whispered anxiously, their customers murmured, and even the street seemed to notice the shift. The balance of power had irrevocably changed, not through confrontation or loud spectacle, but through deliberate, patient, intelligent action. The bakery that had once been mocked, overlooked, and dismissed now held the keys, both literal and metaphorical, to the entire block. That evening, I walked through the block methodically, clipboard in hand, reviewing each storefront, confirming leases, and ensuring that every detail of the transfer was accounted for. Marcy and Elena trailed behind at a distance, hesitant, unsure, clearly weighing options, possibilities, contingencies. But it was too late. The transfer was complete. The signature was mine. The control was absolute. As the sun dipped behind the city skyline, painting the brick facades in golden light, I stood in front of my bakery and allowed myself a quiet, private smile. I had endured years of mockery, years of underestimation, years of dismissal, but now, every ounce of patience, every careful observation, every painstaking calculation had culminated in this moment of undeniable triumph. I recalled the first day I opened the bakery, the jeers, the whispered laughter, the disbelief in Marcy and Elena's eyes. Back then, I had felt small, underestimated, and unseen. But I had learned early that true power is not loud, not performative, it is quiet, deliberate, and inevitable. I had transformed invisibility into authority, dismissal into recognition, and mockery into respect. Later, as night fell, I returned to the bakery, the smell of sugar and yeast mingling with the cool evening air. I prepared a batch of pastries for the next day, every movement calm, deliberate, and precise. The power was no longer theoretical, it was tangible, visible, and undeniable. The block belonged to me. The ex-friends who had mocked and dismissed me had no choice but to accept it. And I, Liana, had claimed my victory with patience, strategy, and quiet, unstoppable determination. The morning after the final lease transfer, the block felt subtly different, as if the buildings themselves recognized the shift in authority. I opened Liana's sweet spot early, the smell of freshly baked pastries curling through the air, wrapping around the small shop like a shield. Outside, the street was calm, yet charged with the residual tension of yesterday's revelation. Elena's café and Marcy's boutique were still open, their staff hesitant, customers whispering. And across it all, I moved with calm assurance, knowing the invisible current of control flowed steadily in my direction. The ex-friends no longer tried to assert dominance. They came to me with polite requests, tentative questions, seeking permission for minor operational details. It was surreal, the power reversal complete. The ones who once laughed at my tiny bakery now relied on me, not just for authority over the properties, but for guidance, approvals, and even subtle advice about managing their spaces under the new structure. I answered each inquiry with calm, measured words, each response a reminder of the quiet patience that had brought me here. That afternoon, I walked the block alone, clipboard in hand, observing everything as if I were both a visitor and the ruler of the territory. The sun cast long shadows over the sidewalks, the brick facades glowing in gold. Every door, every window, every sign, each represented a small victory in my journey from underestimated baker to undeniable authority. I paused in front of the café, letting my reflection in the glass linger. Elena stared back at me from inside, her expression a mix of resignation and disbelief. Marcy's boutique displayed neatly folded clothes, but her movements were tense, cautious. The arrogance of the past had evaporated, replaced by acknowledgement, whether they liked it or not. I reflected on the years that led to this moment, the countless hours of baking late into the night, perfecting recipes while enduring ridicule, the research, the observations, the patient investment in a block no one else had valued, the quiet resilience that allowed me to transform mockery into motivation. Every jeer, every scoff, every dismissive glance had been recorded in the ledger of my mind, silently fueling a strategy that culminated in this inevitable triumph. Inside the bakery, a regular customer commented on the change in the block. "I've never seen the street like this," she said, eyes wide. "It feels different, more organized, more alive." I smiled softly, pouring coffee. "Sometimes, patience and preparation create subtle revolutions," I said. It was true. This was not about revenge in a conventional sense, not about spectacle or humiliation. My victory was in inevitability, the quiet acknowledgement that I had claimed what was mine, without raising my voice, without theatrics, without anger. That evening, I stood outside my bakery as the city lights flickered on, illuminating the street in soft, warm hues. The hum of traffic and distant chatter filled the air, but I felt a serene stillness within. Elena and Marcy had retreated for the day, their staffs busy yet subdued, aware that every decision now passed through the lens of my authority. I allowed myself a moment to savor the satisfaction that comes from patience, intelligence, and deliberate action, the kind of triumph that cannot be reversed, the kind that lingers quietly but powerfully. I thought back to the first day I opened Liana's sweet spot, when their laughter had echoed across the room, mocking my dreams. Back then I had felt small, unseen, dismissed. Yet even in those moments, I had recognized the power of quiet persistence. Every tray of donuts, every carefully counted cash register, every observation of the street, every late-night study of property laws and zoning regulations, it had all been part of a long, deliberate arc. And now, the arc had reached its crescendo. Later, alone in the bakery, I prepared a final batch of pastries for the next day, each movement calm, precise, and deliberate. The aroma of sugar, yeast, and warm dough wrapped around me, comforting and victorious. The block belonged to me, not just in legal terms, but in the quiet, undeniable authority I had cultivated over years. I realized that the most profound satisfaction comes not from confrontation, but from inevitability. The underdog, underestimated and dismissed, had quietly, methodically, and completely claimed what had been theirs all along. As night fell and the street emptied, I looked out the window one last time, reflecting on the journey. Patience had been my ally, observation my weapon, and persistence my shield. The laughter that once stung now felt like a distant echo, replaced by quiet acknowledgement, respect, and the subtle but absolute power of inevitability. I closed the shop lights, the aroma of baked goods lingering like a soft reminder of the triumph I had claimed. The block was mine, and my ex-friends would remember this day for the rest of their lives, not as a moment of vengeance, but as the undeniable proof that underestimation has consequences. I stepped outside one last time, inhaling the cool night air, and whispered to myself, "They laughed, and I became the quiet storm they never saw coming."